Tonight we have a speaker, Nick Schreck, from the Great Lakes Environmental Law Center. He's the executive director. He's a professor at Wayne State, and his specialty is environmental law. And we've invited him here tonight to speak about water rights and a critical issue for us because, you know, we are the Great Lakes state, a resource like no other on the planet, and it's something we forget a lot, and something to protect, and that's his job. It's one of the things he's dedicated himself to, is to taking legal steps to protect an invaluable resource. And he's going to speak, we hope, to some degree about fracking tonight, which is a hot button topic for a lot of people. So without further ado, this is Nick Schreck. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you, David. Well, thank you. Great crowd. Appreciate you guys all coming out tonight on a pretty nice night here in March. So what I'm going to do is just go through a little bit of background on the Great Lakes in general, talk about what I see as some of the emerging threats to the resource, and when we get there, we'll talk a little bit about fracking and oil and gas development in general. I'd like to keep it relatively informal, so if you have questions as I go along, don't be too shy about raising your hand. And then at the end, of course, I'd like to have some Q&A and back and forth. While we're talking about fracking, I also, as David mentioned, work on a whole host of issues, from invasive species to energy development, you name it. So if you have questions about any of those areas, I'm more than happy to talk to you all about that. So without further ado, just a nice little satellite photo there of the Great Lakes. One thing that, don't worry, it gets worse, sorry. One thing I like to point out, this little spot up here on the map, my family has a cabin right along the St. Mary's River. And when I talk about the Great Lakes and think about the Great Lakes, I would encourage you to, if you have a place where maybe you went camping as a kid or where you sometimes go to enjoy the resource, to think about that as we go through tonight and what it means to you. If you haven't had a chance to go out and enjoy any of our Great Lakes, beaches, out on the water, on a boat, fishing, I encourage you to do that. Truly is an amazing resource that we have here in the region, and something that I hope you'll find a place in your heart as you continue to go along throughout your life. So without further ado, Great Lakes Environmental Law Center is an organization that was founded in 2008. One of my colleagues, Noah Hall at the law school at Wayne State, founded the organization. Reason being is that he identified a real need for public interest environmental law here in the state. And what I mean by that is environmental law representing citizen organizations or environmental groups who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford legal representation. So we try and take on those cases or those issues and support those groups and organizations that otherwise would be kind of locked out of the judicial process just because of a funding issue. They don't have access to those resources. So there's a website. You can also find us on Facebook. I try and update it fairly regularly, and there's clips of me out talking and that kind of thing, so very exciting. All right, about the Great Lakes. So we have 8 US states and 2 Canadian provinces that border the Great Lakes, and also the St. Lawrence River, which makes its way out into the Atlantic Ocean. It's important for a lot of reasons, but I want you to think a little bit politically about how we're situated. And for many, many years, the Great Lakes region had a vast amount of political power in Washington, D.C., and also just across the nation due to our population, due to the number of representatives that we had in the House of Representatives. And some of those trends have started to shift, right? We've seen people move and relocate to the south and to the west. And so when we talk about protecting our Great Lakes, it's important that we remain very vigilant, because we're actually kind of year by year losing political power as people move away from the region. Anyway, so I just want to give you a sense of what the Great Lakes Basin is. And that's this green outline. And think of that as a soup bowl. And any rain or snow melt that falls or runs into that green area goes into the Great Lakes. Anything outside of that green goes towards the Mississippi, or towards the Hudson Bay, or towards the Atlantic Ocean. And it's important for a lot of reasons, but when we think about the amount of water that we have in the Great Lakes, and when we talk about oil and gas development and the amount of water that's involved in fracking, the water within the lakes themselves just kind of gets renewed by whatever falls within this green soup bowl. And that's only about 1% of the amount of the Great Lakes annually that gets renewed by snowfall and rainwater. So if we start depleting that resource, over time, it's not going to be able to keep up with our human intervention taking that water out of there. Most of the water in the Great Lakes, about 99% of it, is left over from the glaciers. Okay? About 10% of the US population still lives within the Great Lakes region. 30% of the Canadian population lives within the Great Lakes. So not an insignificant portion of our population. Millions of people in both countries depend on the Great Lakes for drinking water, for irrigation for crops, for manufacturing. One of the main reasons why a lot of auto companies, steel mills, et cetera, are located here is because of the access to good fresh water that they didn't have to pre-treat. They could just use that water for their industrial processes and go ahead and build products and all of those things that really kind of built the region. The Great Lakes are also an interconnected channel. The St. Lawrence River that goes out to the Atlantic Ocean. Back in the 1950s, the St. Lawrence Seaway opened, and there's a series of canals. There's the Welland Canal that connects Lake Erie to Lake Ontario. It wasn't very easy for ships to go over Niagara Falls, so they had to figure out another way to get around there. They developed the Welland Canal. And then ships now, you have a passage all the way through, up into Duluth, Superior, Wisconsin, all the way back around to Chicago. And it's a open shipping lane all across the Great Lakes. It's important to think about that when we discuss invasive species in a little bit and about how they get into the lakes and how they move around. But going back to the 1950s, the Great Lakes have been connected to the world internationally as a major source of cargo coming in and out of the system. Okay, so some threats to the Great Lakes. Climate change, obviously a biggie, and land use, invasive species. So I'm just going to talk about these briefly, and then we'll get into a little bit more into the energy generation. So climate change. The models, when we look at them, we're still not exactly sure what climate change means for the Great Lakes. But there's a few things that we can say with a pretty good degree of certainty. Precipitation is going to change, right? Rather than consistent sort of average rain events, we're looking at less frequent storms, but more intense storms. And that's a problem in dealing with runoff and protecting water quality. A lot of our sewer systems around the Great Lakes are what we call combined sewer systems, meaning that our storm sewers that collects water runoff are connected to the sanitary sewers where you flush the toilet. So what happens is you have a big rain event, the system can't handle all that water coming in from the storm, and they have to open up the floodgates and allow all that nastiness to be discharged into our rivers, streams, and lakes. And we're seeing with climate change, we're going to have to kind of rethink what is a 100-year storm, a storm that only happens once every 100 years or every 50 years. If you start having a 50-year storm twice a year, you have to really consider design changes to your infrastructure systems. Right now, we're experiencing historically low lake levels on the Great Lakes. Lakes Huron and Michigan, which are actually one connected lake through the Straits of Mackinac up there by the Mackinac Bridge, it's actually one connected lake hydrologically. They're at a historic low level. Lake levels do fluctuate over time. They kind of go up and down with the seasons, but also on a yearly cycle. But this is the lowest that Huron and Michigan have ever been. In fact, the lakes are so low right now, there's a diversion in Chicago that anybody heard about Asian carp in the room? Okay. The Chicago Canal system was designed to take Chicago's waste, their sewage and everything, and flush it down towards the Mississippi River. So they actually reversed the flow of this river, the Chicago Canal. And the lake levels are so low right now, there's a concern with the Army Corps of Engineers that that river is going to reverse its flow and go back into Lake Michigan, or at least not flow very quickly at all because there isn't enough water coming in from Lake Michigan. So that just shows you what a historically kind of low level we're at right now. And sort of we'll have to wait and see. Do we continue to have hot, dry summers? But more importantly, think about what happens in the winter. When we have ice on the lakes, snow collects on that ice, and that, when the sun beats down in the wintertime, kind of reflects that energy from the sun off of the ice. When you don't have that ice and the sun can just continue to beat down into the water, it gets warmer. So we're also seeing historically high lake temperatures. Last January, Lake Michigan had, I forget the exact amount, it was high 40-degree readings. which isn't really good for a wintertime reading out in the lake. So decreased ice cover means more evaporation. When I talked about that 1% renewed annually in the Great Lakes from rainwater and snowmelt, if that's drying up and raining down on the eastern part of the United States or out over the ocean, that's going to be depleting the amount of water that we have within the Great Lakes system. So a lot of potential impacts from climate change. So think about water availability and water scarcity as we start talking about fracking in a minute. Land use. Sprawl, right? We keep doing it. We know it's not the best thing, but we like our cars and we like driving one person in a car everywhere as fast as we can possibly go. And that has changed population density. We continue to use more and more land around the region. The other thing is that it's nice to live by the water, right? People like to live near a lake, near a river, and come on in. No problem. And so we're seeing density, population density shifting from inland parts of the country to the coasts, and that includes the Great Lakes coasts. When we have more development along the shoreline, that means things like wetlands are filled in, and wetlands are very important for filtering pollutants out of rainwater before it makes its way into the lakes. So land use changes have been a really big impact in the Great Lakes. We've altered in some way or completely destroyed about 80% of the historic Great Lakes wetlands, so kind of pre-European settlement. About 80% of those wetlands have been altered or destroyed, and we're left with about 20%. So it just shows you, and that kind of decreases the resiliency of the natural systems for when you have things like climate change that come in and add a kind of like light a match underneath an already stressed system. Invasive species. I mentioned Asian carp. That's the big hot button issue of the day. Asian carp, it's a species that was actually multiple species. The two that we're most concerned about are the big-headed carp and the silver carp. The silver carp are the ones that jump out of the water. If you've seen any of those videos on YouTube, they're kind of funny, but a scary fish nonetheless. The propeller noise of the boat scares them up and they actually jump out of the water. So those carp are in the Chicago Canal system. And go back here. So we're talking about right here. And this is where there's an artificial connection, even right there it says Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. The carp are right here, and they're stacked up behind an electronic barrier that is at the bottom of the Chicago Canal. And that barrier creates a field of electricity that goes up through the water column. And the thinking is that the carp, they get up there, they can feel the electricity, they get shocked, and they turn away. What happens if you have a power outage for an extended period of time or significant flooding? It's a very flat part of the country, if anybody's driven along there. And in fact, you can see the Great Lakes Basin, how close the basin line is to the shoreline right there. In times of snowmelt in the winter and high amounts of precipitation, significant flooding. So there's concerns that the carp could spill out of these canals and into Lake Michigan. So not to scare you or anything, but I do believe we're going to be dealing with the Asian carp issue for a good period of time. Hopefully we can keep them contained out of the Great Lakes, but if they get in, inevitably we're going to be dealing with some kind of a management action. That means some sort of chemical or biological treatment, coming up with some way to hopefully stop them from reproducing at a really rapid pace, which is what they do. So the biggest concern with the Asian carp is that they're bottom feeders and they will outcompete other fish species for food. And so then the smaller fish in the lakes will die off, and those smaller fish are, of course, the ones that get eaten by our bigger fish, like walleye, lake trout, salmon, that kind of thing. So the big concern is that the carp are just going to really upend the food chain and decimate the lakes that are already stressed. Who here has heard of zebra mussels? Show of hands. Pretty much everybody. Okay. Aquatic invasive species that was brought in from an international ship that came in that St. Lawrence Seaway. In the storage tanks, or basically the holds of these ships, where they suck in seawater or lake water to stabilize their ships when they're out traveling in the open ocean or on the Great Lakes. And then they discharge that water and that can move around the aquatic species. So zebra mussels have been a multi-billion-dollar a year problem for the Great Lakes. They collect and cling on water intake structures and also outfalls from things like our wastewater treatment plants. That means they have to be chiseled off. You have to send divers down below water to get the zebra mussels out of those intakes. Plus, they're really sharp and nasty when they wash up on the beach and people cut their feet and that type of thing. And they filter out microorganisms out of the food chain that, again, kind of exacerbates the problem that I talked about with Asian carp. So going back to the sea lamprey, which was a critter that swam in when the seaway was opened back in the 1950s, we're dealing with these invasive species on a continual basis, and they really weaken the system that, again, is already stressed because of climate change and human action. Emerging chemicals. Talking about things like endocrine disrupting chemicals, hormone medications, birth control pills, that kind of stuff. When it gets released from our bodies, we're not screening for it or treating it at wastewater treatment plants, so it makes its way into the surface waters eventually. At small microscopic levels, some of these compounds, chemicals, can be harmful to aquatic life. We're seeing some depletions in frog populations and other amphibians, but also there was a really interesting study on Lake Erie looking at perch, yellow perch populations by a major sewage plant outfall, and they found almost all female perch. So something's happening with the biology of these fish where essentially they're going to become extinct if something's not done about it because they can't reproduce. Also things like pesticides, herbicides, any sort of chemical compounds that our really smart scientists dream up and create products that we really like and oftentimes we don't even know what's in them. All of those things can have impacts when they make their way into our lakes and streams. Think about hand sanitizer or soap, liquid soap that has triclosan in it. That's designed to kill bacteria. Well, that stuff just washes down the drain and it ends up getting into our water. And we don't really know what those impacts are yet because studies of new drug applications before they put new drugs on the market, oftentimes they don't require an environmental assessment for the end of use, meaning once it goes down the drain and down into the wastewater plant. If you're interested in that issue, the New York Times did a really interesting study last year where they worked with some Associated Press writers too, and they just sampled water at outfall points from wastewater treatment facilities, and they found some really interesting chemicals. And that's not even to say like what happens when they interact with each other, when these compounds that are intended to be a dose for a human interact with something else. It can lead to some pretty interesting chemical compounds. Nutrients in algae. Have people heard about the algae blooms on Lake Erie? All right, some fewer folks, but concern there is that some of that algae can actually be toxic, and it also depletes the amount of oxygen available in Lake Erie. So that can have problems, obviously, for aquatic life. If there's not enough oxygen in the water, the fish can't live. Algae, the problem is exacerbated by some nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen, among others, but phosphorus and nitrogen are the big two, and there's phosphorus in human waste, there's phosphorus in a lot of fertilizers. So we see in the summer, there's some really interesting satellite imagery of Lake Erie. After big rain events, a couple days later, you'll start to see these just green blobs grow on Lake Erie that you can see from space. And that's just the algae kind of feeding off those nutrients. So a lot of work is being done to try and rein in phosphorus and nitrogen pollution from point sources like wastewater treatment plants, but also for agriculture and for your lawns. If you live anywhere near a water body, please don't put fertilizers with phosphorus and nitrogen on your lawn. It ends up leading to a lot of problems in the aquatic environment. Energy generation. All right, now we're going to get into fracking. So historically in the Great Lakes, we have had oil and gas development, and there has been fracking in the region. And when I talk about fracking, it's hydraulic fracturing is a tool that industry, the way they explain it is that you complete a well. So you drill down into the ground to try and hit a pocket of gas or oil, and then once that pocket has been depleted, you can either drill further down or horizontally, and you can use water, a variety of chemicals, and proppant, which is sand most times, or fine little like beads, either glass or plastic beads that they develop to use in fracking. And what they do is under high pressure, they force that water mixture underground and exposes these fissures in shale rock, and that allows the gas or oil to seep out, go up the pipe, and then be collected. The difference between the way that fracturing was done and the way it's done now is that they're drilling much deeper, and then they're also able to drill horizontally. So once they get to the bottom of their well, they can turn left or right and really go in a 360-degree turn, more or less, and continue to get more oil and gas out of that shale formation. So in a lot of ways, this is a good thing. If you're drilling for oil and gas and you have to have a major environmental footprint up here at the wellhead, where you you pour concrete, you have earth movers come in and they have to create space to actually have the well. If you can, from this one well, get oil and gas out of this entire area instead of having 5 or 6 well heads drilled in, hypothetically that's a good thing. The yields of oil and gas coming out of some of these shale formations have increased dramatically, meaning they're getting a lot more oil and gas out of these wells than they were prior to using this fracturing process. So it's led to a boom in both oil and gas development. You've probably heard about all the wells going out in North and South Dakota and out west, but also here in Michigan and in the eastern part of the United States, Ohio, Pennsylvania. Fracturing is becoming a really big thing. So does everyone kind of understand the way this process works? You have this slurry of water and other chemicals. It's mainly water, but then chemicals and some sort of proppant or sand that opens up these fissures under high pressure. So that's how it works. Some problems or concerns that we have with fracturing. Well, as I talked about earlier, water supply and water scarcity is a big issue. Here in the Great Lakes region, of course, we have a lot of water. We have all the quadrillions of gallons of water in the Great Lakes, and we also have a lot of groundwater. But as I talked about at the beginning, only 1% of our Great Lakes water is renewed by rainwater and snowmelt. And the other problem is when we're in times of drought, if we're pumping a bunch of groundwater to do oil and gas drilling, that has some other impacts. Do we have enough water for crops? Do we have enough water for human health, for our kind of domestic uses that we need that water for? Not as big of an issue yet in Michigan as it is in other parts of the country. But you guys probably heard about the historic droughts they've been having in the Central Plains, another area where fracking is booming. So what they're having to do is they're having to truck in water, or they're drilling deeper and deeper into their aquifers, which those aquifers, in a lot of ways, once they're gone, because the recharge rate is many, many, many decades to get that water back in their underground aquifers out in the plains. So it's something we should be concerned about. Incidentally, a green fuel, ethanol, corn-based ethanol, is actually leading to other problems with water scarcity because it takes a heck of a lot of water to grow corn. When you have a drought and you have to irrigate, that is also leading to some problems in the plains with water scarcity. But as we'll talk about in more detail, here in the Great Lakes, we should be concerned about the amount of water that's used for a fracturing job. Between 2 to 3 or 7 and 10 million gallons of water, depending on how deep they go, per fracturing job, okay? And when I say fracturing job, wells can be fracked multiple times. So 6 or 7 times it could actually be at the same well fracturing. So you start doing the math, we're talking, tens of millions of gallons of water per well. Question?
Are there specific areas of Michigan where fracking is more common? Is it all over the state?
Go back to the map here for you. So there's 2 shales, and when you hear about shales, they call them shale plays or oil and gas plays. And we have 2. We have the Collingwood and Antrim shale. And I'll probably screw this up, but I believe the Collingwood is deeper than the Antrim. Most of that activity is going to be up in here, kind of northern third or northern half of the state. But that shale formation pretty much covers the entire state of Michigan, specifically the Collingwood shale. And a lot of it's kind of deep, meaning that the deeper you go, the more water you have to use. So when I talked about that roughly 2 to 10 million gallons of water per fracturing job, there's been some wells that were fracked last summer in Michigan where the reports are much higher, 15 to 20 million gallons per operation. Yes, ma'am.
Is this occurring mostly in new green locations, or are they going back to old wells? Because you said this is,
Right.
This new technology.
Right.
You should be going back to those old wells and hitting those.
Right.
before
So
they start.
that's a really good point. So yeah, there's some wells that they're going back and completing them with hydraulic fracturing where there's already an existing wellhead. Maybe they're still bringing out some oil or natural gas from that well, and they go in and they do a fracturing operation. But the thing that's interesting about that is they may not have to give notice to the community or to the adjacent property owners. So you could think that well's been completely done with for years. The next thing you know, the trucks start rolling in.
Rights or something.
Right, exactly. Yeah, because the mineral rights, they may have them forever, basically.
Is there a lot of new wells?
There are a lot of new proposals. There's been a couple lease auctions in Michigan over the last 2 years, and they've been gangbusters. I mean, speculators have been coming in, or just investors, and buying up these lease rights. all over the state. Livonia.
Auctions twice a year.
Right.
In our-
Right, and it's a lot of money. I mean, it's been many millions of dollars, and it's a big concern because a lot of these areas are residential, or they're even natural areas, state land, state parks, that kind of thing, that are potentially up for development. And what's interesting about fracturing is because of that horizontal drilling capability, you can put a wellhead on someone else's property, and then they can go underground, subterraneously, and go under other people's property, which they are supposed to get rights to do that, and they typically do. But hypothetically, you could have fracturing going on under your property and not know.
So what's the regulation on that? Because my understanding is that some of those horizontal fracking can be even like a mile. Is that how far can it go, and who regulates that? I mean, do people actually come out and audit?
I'm not exactly sure like how far the farthest horizontal well has gone, but I mean, certainly quarter mile, half mile. I don't know exactly what the end point is, but they can go a great distance. So I'm going to come back to that a little bit, because I'm going to talk about regulations in a second. But so the other thing, when we do this fracking, the water that is used, I mentioned the chemicals that are involved and the proppant, that water becomes contaminated, and at that point it is not fit to be re-released, right? You can't just take that water and dump it into a river or let it sit out in a pond. It's highly contaminated. And so what happens is, in Michigan and in most other states, they take this contaminated water and they put it in injection wells, which is basically a underground storage tank where you're going to store this contaminated water forever. So effectively, you're taking these millions of gallons of water per job out of the water cycle, right? And you're contaminating it, and you're putting it underground and leaving it there potentially forever. Now, there's some talk about some industry practices that are coming online where they can recycle and reuse this water. Hasn't happened yet, okay? This is what's always pointed to by the companies. They say, we're developing the technology. It's not there yet. And frankly, it's cheap to pump groundwater and to use it for fracturing. And on that point, Michigan passed in 2008 a law it actually implemented something called the Great Lakes Compact. And the compact deals with diversions of water out of the Great Lakes region. It prevents that from happening. But it also made the states adopt certain regulations for water withdrawals, both ground and surface water. Interestingly enough, before fracking was even really on anybody's radar screen, oil and gas development is specifically exempt from Michigan's water withdrawal statute. So anyone else, if you or I want to open a car wash or some factory, and we're going to pump 100,000 gallons a day of water or more, which sounds like a lot, but it really isn't on an industrial scale or even on a large apartment building or hospital type scale. They can use that amount of water. We'd have to get a permit from the state. And oil and gas companies are specifically exempt from that law. Now, they've been required, or not required, it's been suggested that they go ahead and run their proposed withdrawals through an online tool that's been developed as part of this program. But the answer is unclear what would happen if the State Department of Environmental Quality said, no, you can't withdraw that water, what the driller would say. Odds are they would probably just march into court and say, we're exempted from this law and we can do what we want, hypothetically. So that's a concern. Air pollution. I apologize I didn't have time to pull up the picture, but there's some really great satellite imagery, recent pictures of the central part of the country where 10 years ago it was just completely dark at night when you had satellites were flying over the continent at night. Now there's big bright lights in the middle of North Dakota, South Dakota. There's not people there. What it is you can see from space the flaring, the actual just burning off of gas, methane, other things from these wells. I've seen numbers that are all over the map, but probably enough gas is just flared, just burned off to be able to heat 1 million homes or more on a daily basis right now, just through waste, basically. We're just burning it off. The reason is because some of that gas is hard to capture. Also, gas prices are so low right now that they basically just kind of take what they need and then they burn off the rest because it's relatively expensive to either truck it or send it by a pipeline to other parts of the country. Methane is a greenhouse gas. In a lot of ways, it's worse than Worse than carbon dioxide?
That's what I was-
Yeah. All right, I'm reading your mind. Okay, good. Yeah, not good. And so methane actually exacerbates the problem. Some scientists could probably tell you more about it than I can, but methane's not good. A little bit of methane is a lot worse than a lot of CO2, okay? So methane is a byproduct that comes out of the, actually leaks from the wells itself, but then they also burn it off as part of the flaring operation. But it's just something to always consider. Heavy equipment, I mentioned this a little bit, where if you're in an area where you don't have a groundwater well or a surface body of water to withdraw your water for your fracking operation, they have to truck it in. So tanker after tanker of water comes into these wellheads. Small rural communities are not really anticipating the amount of truck traffic, the amount of noise. There's associated pollution from diesel. You guys have probably all smelled diesel, the school bus when you were a kid. That they're getting a little bit cleaner as time goes on, but there's a lot of particulate matter in diesel emissions, which can, certainly people with asthma, it's really, really bad for them. So heavy equipment, the noise, the toll on roads, potholes, weakening bridges, that kind of thing, who's going to pay for that? Are the taxes that are associated with oil and gas extraction enough for the state to cover, or the local government to cover fixing up roads and bridges from heavy truck traffic? I don't know. Public notice and engagement. The public notice rules are all over the map. It's really kind of state-based, and the states will kind of determine what provisions are allowed for public notice and involvement. I've heard stories of people that were out, walking their dog and out on the back 40, and they heard some noise and went and did a little investigating, and they found out that there was oil and gas drilling going on there because somebody else had owned the mineral rights and a neighbor had, granted them access from their property. So it's not like something that you see in the local paper, like a new shopping mall coming in where there's going to be a zoning board meeting about it. And a lot of times it just happens because the mineral rights have already been secured, and once they have the go-ahead from a property owner for access, they can go ahead and start their drilling. So that's one thing that we've been working on pretty aggressively, is trying to increase the amount of public notice and involvement, and also to talk to local communities, because they might want to look at some zoning changes. Okay, they may decide that as a community we don't want a lot of truck traffic after 5 p.m. or we want to limit the weight that trucks can be on our roads, that type of thing, the noise at night. So there's been a lot of action at the local level. There's been some communities have considered bans, and some communities have actually banned the practice of fracking, but it's really kind of all over the map. So one thing we've been advocating for is more disclosure, just so people know when it's happening and that they can be involved in that process. Okay, disclosure of chemicals. This has been a big sticking point. Again, states control the disclosure rules for what's in the fracking fluid. Texas actually has a pretty strong disclosure standard, which surprises a lot of people. But they do, and they require that a company will have to at least put on a sheet, a material safety sheet. They'll have to say, these are the chemical compounds that are involved in our fracking fluid. They don't necessarily have to list the percentages or the amounts, because that's considered a business trade secret. Okay? A lot of them view this fracking fluid as their kind of intellectual property that they've created, and it's something that they use in their process, and they don't want their competitor to get a hold of it, which I completely understand. However, in all areas of the law, we require disclosure about what is in something, not necessarily what amounts. I don't really care what the secret sauce is or what the special herbs and spices are, as long as they list what the ingredients actually are in the fracking fluid itself. And that's for a very good reason. If there's an accident, or if the injection well leaks and that gets into an aquifer, people need to know what's in the water. First responders need to know if people are getting sick, so that we can hopefully prevent the unthinkable from happening, is people getting sick or potentially dying from these chemicals. The likelihood of that is probably less than kind of long-term impacts. Eventually you might have an earthquake or something where one of these injection wells starts to leak, and then over time people ingest some of these chemicals. Eventually a lot of this stuff's carcinogenic, which means it can turn into cancers. So that's a concern from folks in the environmental and public health community, that we just need to know what these chemicals are, when they're being used, so that we can be prepared to deal with it. The industry will say that they're using the best practices. They're lining these wells with steel and concrete, and the injection wells are completely contained. But hey, we've seen it too many times before where accidents happen, or people don't do what they said they were doing. A contractor screws up, and next thing you know, you've got an oil rig on fire in the Gulf of Mexico for 2 weeks and nobody can put the thing out. So we just want to know what's there, what's in it, not necessarily the actual formula, but just what's in it. Lack of local control. This is a problem where oil and gas developers have been really good. They've probably had great attorneys who have been able to exempt oil and gas development from a lot of our environmental laws. I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but it's just something to talk to your friends and family about, that if they're concerned about this practice, it's something that local township boards, city councils, zoning boards can look into. And they can look at restricting certain types of truck traffic like we talked about, noise, water withdrawals. They can actually do some local control of water withdrawals at amounts less than 100,000 gallons per day. Then they wouldn't conflict with the state law, which is a higher authority. So it's just something to think about. There's really a lack of local control right now, but there are communities across the state that have looked at everything from a ban all the way on down to limiting the size and amount of truck traffic that they can have on their roads. This slide was put together by the Natural Resource Defense Council, and this is just some of the concerns that the environmental community has identified with fracking. So this will be on the test later, everybody study it. But it just gives you an idea of what we're looking at. And I've touched on a lot of these, but some unanticipated consequences like crime out west in North and South Dakota. I mean, basically you have like tent cities that spring up to deal with all the workers that come out for this oil and gas boom, and they don't have the infrastructure to deal with people. So you got a lot of young men who are making really good money, and they don't have anything to do, just sitting in their basically a trailer type environment for weeks on end, and then they go to work. So you have a lot of instances of substance abuse, drug and alcohol abuse, and then associated crime with that, which in small rural communities you're really not expecting. You're excited about the economic development, but oftentimes we're not ready for some of those other consequences. I'm not a criminologist or anything, but I just thought I'd point that out. So you can see there's a lot of concerns, and this all, I'm not going to say that fracking is inherently bad or it's something that we need to necessarily ban, but we've got to be concerned about the impacts and make sure that we have proper environmental protections in place. Unfortunately, what's happened is the fracking started, and then everybody else kind of got up to speed, and we've tried to go back and pass some rules and regulations after it's already begun. Fortunately, in Michigan, it's still in its infancy, so we're passing some rules and regulations that are hopefully going to protect the environment, at least to some degree. So, well integrity, I mentioned that earlier, but making sure that they're following, they're doing what they say they do as far as the type of pipes that they're using and the type of sealants, making sure that they're all sealed up and there's not a chance that fracking fluid can migrate from the drilling operation into an adjacent aquifer. Same thing goes for the injection wells, making sure they're closely regulated so that we don't have any leaks. Fees, this is a big one for me. How much money are we capturing, we as a public, from oil and gas revenue on public lands? Not much. Our mineral fee structure goes back to the old copper glory days up in the UP, turn a couple centuries ago. And it's just a percentage basically on the amount of material that you bring out of a certain mining or drilling operation. We really need to look at that, because without some just reasonable fees, I'm not talking about putting anybody out of business here, but reasonable fees to pay for inspectors, to pay for staff, because our Department of Environmental Quality is woefully underfunded. We don't have enough inspectors right now to inspect existing pipelines, oil and gas pipelines like the one that burst on the Kalamazoo River a couple summers ago. We just have a handful of people that are doing all these inspections, and it's because there's not enough money. There's not enough money in the budget. My proposal would be, hey, if you're going to be doing the deed itself, you got to be able to support the regulatory environment. We do this to some extent with our air monitoring. Large sources of air pollution have to pay fees that helps support the air quality division of the DEQ that monitors. We need to come up with something to really bolster our oversight, because it's woefully inadequate at this point. The state would tell you that it's fine, they got a handle on it, but they don't. Disclosure, disclosure, disclosure. This goes back to chemicals, goes back to notice of when they're going to start their operations. Basically just letting the public know what's going on, when it's going on, so that we can hopefully avoid any potential accidents from happening. Water quality monitoring. what we would like to see is have a baseline. Before you come into an area and do fracturing, put in some test wells, sample the water, and see what types of pollutants are already in the water or what types of minerals are there, so we have a baseline. Then once you start doing your fracking, you continuously monitor that well, and then you also do it after you've stopped. And that way we could see if there's, well, some benzene popped up in this water that we didn't see before. Having some water quality monitoring is very important, something that should be required. Okay, federal oversight. I talked about oil and gas companies. It's almost like they can see into the future, and they know what they're doing 10 or 15 years before anyone else figures it out. Safe Drinking Water Act. This is a federal law that, in theory, protects the quality of our drinking water. So any municipal source, meaning any public water supply, they have to comply with the Safe Drinking Water Act. They have to test the water to make sure it's safe for human consumption. Whether it comes from a Great Lake or from the ground, they have to comply with the Safe Drinking Water Act. Interestingly, oil and gas development, they don't have to get permitted authority under the Safe Drinking Water Act from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. They call this the Halliburton loophole. Mr. Vice President Dick Cheney, regardless of what you think about him otherwise, was pretty darn good at inserting this type of stuff in there for the companies that he either worked for or after he left office. And so they call this the Halliburton loophole. Basically, oil and gas is exempt from regulation under the Safe Drinking Water Act, which severely limits EPA's authority to deal with this type of thing. All the EPA right now is regulating on fracking, besides some of the air pollution issues, is the types of chemicals that are used in the fracking fluid, but only one specific type, diesel fuel. If a company uses diesel fuel as part of their fracking operation, putting it down in the well, then EPA has some oversight. But most of the fracturing operations don't use diesel, they use other things. So it's really kind of toothless, as they say. Oh, yeah.
After the Halliburton loophole, isn't that when this new fracking took off all over the country? Or
Yeah,
is that
so-
just a coincidence?
Well, I'd say it's closely related. I mean, you had the technology was developing, and it was kind of in the pipeline. Pardon the pun. I mean, they were actually working on it. So I don't necessarily know that it was one before the other, but it certainly didn't slow it down. And I mean, industry, they knew what they were doing. So they saw this as an opportunity to just lower the amount of regulation so that they could speed through their permits and get on with it. But I don't know enough about the timeline there to give you a definitive answer, but it certainly didn't slow down fracturing. I'll tell you that much. So one thing that I've been floating around is an idea. I talked about this Great Lakes Compact, which prevents diversions of water out of the Great Lakes. That was signed by all 8 Great Lakes states. Identical legislation passed State House, State Senate, and was signed by every governor back from about 2005 through 2007. And then it was signed, it had to pass through the U.S. Congress, same exact legislation, so the U.S. House and Senate, and then President Bush actually signed it in 2008. And what the compact does is it prevents large-scale diversions of water out of the Great Lakes Basin. So in essence, you couldn't put a pipeline in Lake Huron and send water to space or to China or elsewhere. There were actual proposals for big tanker barges of water to be filled and sent to Asia, where they have some water scarcity issues. So the compact prevents that from happening. The 8 Great Lakes states agreed to prevent that activity. They also agreed to pass some water conservation and efficiency measures within that soup bowl of the Great Lakes Basin. So a state like Michigan, we're 99.5% within the Great Lakes Basin. There's a couple little small areas in the southwestern portion of the state and then a little chunk of the western upper peninsula that are not in the Great Lakes Basin, but pretty much the whole state. Other states like Illinois have a little sliver where they're in the basin, Indiana a little sliver, Pennsylvania a little sliver. But for Michigan, we're wholly within the basin, which means we have a real interest in making sure we protect the Great Lakes and don't allow water to be sent elsewhere. So my theory that I've been floating around is that, is it not, if we're withdrawing millions of gallons of water, contaminating it through a fracking operation, then putting it down in an injection well, wouldn't that be considered a diversion by another name? In the business, we call it a consumptive use, when you take water out of the productive water cycle. And consumptive use is allowed for pretty much anything. If you're making beer or Coca-Cola or growing a crop, there's a portion of that water that you use to make that product, and then the rest of it goes back into the natural environment, either on the ground, it falls on the ground, or you have it discharged through a pipe into a surface water. Well, consumptive use is fine, but if that consumptive use is 100% of the water, that I think is consumptive use by another name. It's in property law, we call it a taking. Sometimes we're taking property from someone. So I would argue that under the compact, there's existing authority for these 8 Great Lakes states to look at a regulation of ground and surface water for oil and gas development. They've got that authority. There's each governor has a designated that meets in this compact council, and they review the state's laws and make sure that they're following conservation and efficiency measures. And it's an idea that we've had to look at here. It's existing authority. We don't have to pass any new laws. We don't have to get all these states to agree to something else, because that'll never happen. But it's just something that we're looking at as a way of hopefully addressing this issue. So that's a recommendation that we've been making.
Is a part of the compact defining extraction and taking it geographically out of the area? Or is this, I mean, are you having to redefine it by saying that it's taken out of the cycle entirely?
Right. The compact is pretty clear that they're talking about moving water over that basin line. So out of that soup bowl by truck, plane, pipeline, what have you. That's what was meant by a diversion. So you definitely would have to do some creative lawyer wordsmithing to get around that. But I do believe that with the consumptive use issue, because the compact is also very clear that you can get a permit to withdraw water, but whatever you don't use, or after you're done with your production, you have to return that to the source watershed, to the basin. So if you're pulling water out of Lake Erie, once you're done with whatever you need, you got to put it back into Lake Erie. And that's something where if we're taking water out of one of the lakes or one of the watersheds from groundwater and not returning any of it, arguably that would violate the compact's requirement that you return water to the watershed less consumptive use. Before we get to that, just one more quick thing. Oh, yeah, I jumped ahead there. There we go. Great Lakes economy. So our Great Lakes are more than just something that we're passionate about and that we care about. They're also really a driver of our economic growth and our really kind of how we came to be here. The reason why people settled here in the first place was because they were near bodies of water. It's always kind of been part of our history, and I think it will continue to be. Even with climate change, I think that can be an asset to the region in a lot of ways. It's going to be a lot less comfortable in Texas and Oklahoma in the summer than it already is. Some of the projections, you look at the maps, show Michigan summers looking like Oklahoma summers in about 100 years. Well, I'd rather be there than whatever the heck's going on in Oklahoma, I'll tell you that much. Maybe that's just me, I'm more of a northern climate kind of guy. But our Great Lakes, I think, will also help bring people back to the region. Having a reliable source of good quality fresh water is important for manufacturing, for agriculture. And I think we're going to continue to see our region, because of this tremendous resource, be somewhere where people want to locate and live and to start businesses. However, my caveat here is that they have to be clean and they have to be welcoming. We have to have public access. You know, a lot of you guys that are younger, you're probably thinking about get a career going. I mean, people want to move to Denver, they want to be by the mountains, or California, be by the ocean. I mean, we have a lot of those same assets here in Michigan. It's just that we don't want to have a polluted harbor where you live next to. Okay, we want to clean those up. We want to make sure that we have these pristine, beautiful areas where people can recreate, they can live alongside those beautiful bodies of water. And that does help attract people to the region, both in terms of wanting to live there, but also for economic investment. And that fits into the whole tourism and fishing and agriculture. The Brookings Institution, which is a think tank, they've done a lot of work on the value of Great Lakes restoration and investment in cleaning up the Great Lakes. And what they've found is that if you put in $1 into cleaning up a contaminated port or restoring a park or wetland along the shoreline, which right now is hardened by concrete, that dollar turns into at least $2 or $3 in economic benefit. And people coming in and either locating their businesses there or not moving away. So Great Lakes restoration, it can be a real boon for the economic situation here in the region. I talked a little bit about population trends. I think one way to reverse that is by selling ourselves as, we're not the Rust Belt, we're the Lake Belt or the Great Lakes region. When people say the Midwest, Great Lakes region. It's identifiable, people on the map. If you travel around the world, you say you're from Michigan, people can usually figure that out because they see those big blue, beautiful circles on the map, okay? Just something to think about. Blue economy, talk about our blue economy rather than, our manufacturing economy, whatever. Just not an economics guy, but these are things that I think, people talk about them. It makes us feel good. We have a sense of pride, but it's also true. So that's always good. renewable energy, there's been a lot of discussion about that in the state, with Proposal 3 last year, but also just in general. We currently, in the state of Michigan, we have a requirement that we get 10% of our electricity from renewable sources, meaning wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, biomass, by 2015. So by the year 2015, we have to get 10% of our power from renewable sources. We're on track to do that. All of our utilities are going to meet the mark, with the exception of maybe one, and they're doing it a lot cheaper than they estimated. Detroit Edison, which is my utility, they estimated that they've been surcharging everyone $3 a month on their bill to meet this renewable energy mandate. It's costing them a heck of a lot less than that. There's a case going on right now in the Public Service Commission to try and recover that money, to give it back to us, because they're basically just kind of patting the books with that surcharge right now, because their new contracts for wind are coming in at 40-some cents per kilowatt hour, okay? If you were to build a new coal plant, it's estimated that it would be about $1.30, okay? New nuclear is even higher. The thing that's comparable to that right now is natural gas. This leads back to the fracking thing. If you're not considering the impacts from fracking or from oil and gas drilling, natural gas is a pretty cheap source of fuel right now, but that of course can always change. It's a global commodity like oil. It can fluctuate. I would just put this out to you guys right now. Gas prices are still pretty high, right? Approaching $4, right around there. Demand is down in the country. I mean, way down. Supplies are way up, and yet for some reason, the gas prices are remaining artificially high. So my concern is that with natural gas, the same thing can happen. It fluctuates. You have speculation that goes on. It's traded on a market, and you can have abuse takes place, or the cost goes up. So renewable energy is something that I see as a necessity here for our state in Michigan to make sure that we're developing renewable energy. It's going to be good for us as consumers. But the Great Lakes hook is that our biggest users of Great Lakes water are thermoelectric plants. So coal plants and nuclear plants around the Great Lakes, by far. It's not agriculture. It's not you and I flushing our toilets. It's electricity. Massive amounts of water are used for cooling, but also for the processes, depending on how they're making our electricity. So to the extent that we can transition some of those older, dirtier coal plants get them off the grid, and start ramping up wind and solar, it's going to be a good thing, not only for, I think, economics long term, less environmental pollution and all that, but also greatly decreases the amount of water that's used. And one more tidbit for you guys to go away with. Millions and millions of fish get sucked into those utility plants too, and their water intakes, and there's been some work to try and address that, but basically they suck in water for cooling, and a lot of the older plants don't have new technology on there to help keep the fish away, and so they basically just get sucked up. And two words you can remember, fancy words, impingement and entrainment. You can look them up. One of them means sucked up against the grate, and the other one means chopped up inside the process. But so millions of fish are either impinged or entrained every day around the Great Lakes. So another thing to think about when we don't always discuss these impacts when we talk about our electricity. So one last thing I would say to tell our story. People around the country, when I go and meet folks from East Coast, West Coast, other parts of the world, they really have no concept of how big the Great Lakes are. We're talking 21% of the world's freshwater supply. 21% of the world's freshwater here in the Great Lakes. I've had friends from out of town come in, and you look at Lake Michigan and like, wow, you can't see across it. It's like the ocean. I mean, people really have no concept that they really are freshwater seas, magnificent bodies of water. And so I would encourage you that when you talk to people from around the country, around the world, that you talk about how massive and amazing they are, yet how they're only renewed about 1% annually, and they're very, very vulnerable.
I just moved here 2 months ago from Texas. I'm originally from Michigan, but I moved here from Texas. And then before that, I lived in Louisiana. And I actually found it really interesting that Michigan does a really great job of advertising
Right.
Michigan. I mean, every single day you would see a Pure Michigan commercial on the TV. But what was interesting is when I would talk to people about Michigan, in those other places, people couldn't go in the water. I mean,
Right.
they were surrounded by water, but they couldn't go in the water. So they thought it was the same idea with Michigan. That it's there, but you can't enjoy it.
Thankfully, we've worked really hard to make our Great Lakes swimmable, fishable, and drinkable. some of the ships, the freighters that travel around the Great Lakes, they just pull their drinking water right out of the middle of Lake Huron. They do a minor treatment, but then they use that for their drinking water. But there's still areas where I wouldn't do that, especially after heavy rain. We still, unfortunately, have billions of gallons of sewage that gets flushed into the lakes after every heavy rain. There's a lot of other runoff things. So I wouldn't go out there and start drinking it, but by and large, unless there's an advisory, totally safe to swim and to enjoy. But I just want to leave you with that point, that the scale, the really amazing treasure that we have here, I think we can do a better job of communicating. And it really is something that I think can be a draw to folks to come back here to live and to work and to raise a family. These are my two favorite invasive species. That's donkey. So my last name's Shrek. This is donkey, and that's Vanna. And they're my favorite invasive species. They're not aquatic, but hey, there they are. So with that, I would like to take any more questions. I don't know how we're doing on time, but I'm happy to stay as long as you guys have questions. Or if I talk to you all to death. Yes, sir.
With energy production, about how much more efficient would you say fracking is compared to most other major energy methods?
Well, so natural gas that you get from fracking, which if we're using natural gas as an energy source, it's more efficient than coal. And by efficient, I mean your input in, kind of energy in, energy out, you get a little bit better return. But that doesn't necessarily include the whole life cycle. So when we think about coal, we don't always also think about the mining, where we're getting it from, mountaintop removal. Some of you may have heard about that down south. Same thing with natural gas. When we talk about the dollars that it costs to get the energy out, usually they don't include that whole life cycle of where it was actually withdrawn from, whether or not fracking was used. The other thing that kind of concerns me with natural gas, and I didn't really touch on this, is that while it's better than coal, and when I say better than coal, I mean that there's less pollutants created when we burn it. You don't have the particulate matter type stuff, the soot that you hear about with coal. There's less CO2 that's emitted from burning natural gas. But the problem is it keeps us on a carbon-based source for fuel. And as long as we're sort of wedded to that, that's going to have some, I think, drastic implications for the long-term health of the planet. Whether we're talking about fracking implications locally with water resources, when you look globally at the amount of carbon we're putting into the atmosphere, it's pretty striking. So natural gas is better in that it's cheaper right now. Anybody talking about building a coal plant right now is crazy. The economics don't make any sense. You're going to see coal plants continue to retire over time from economic forces, but also from some regulations. It's getting more and more expensive to use coal to generate electricity. So in the short term, you're going to see some natural gas plants be built to try and continue to generate electricity. One criticism of renewables is that, and you've probably heard this, the sun doesn't always shine for solar, the wind doesn't always blow for wind energy, and that's true, but in my mind, the answer isn't then less renewables, it's more renewables. The more variability we have, the more, Michigan's a really big state. At some point during the day, somewhere in the state of Michigan, the wind's blowing, usually, okay? So having more renewables around, I think, is important, and as we see more, the cost continues to come down. Solar panels are still more expensive than natural gas, okay, to generate electricity, but the cost of solar panel installation was reduced 70% last year alone, okay? It's coming down in some places in the country, California and in New Jersey. Solar power now has reached what they call grid parity, meaning that it's basically the same as any other source of electricity in those states. So as we see more solar and more wind development, those costs are going to continue to come down, and I think eventually we're going to get there. You guys that are in school, figure out ways to store power. If you can figure out, a big battery or some way to store electricity, that's the key to the future right there. We waste so much power right now. At night, we have coal plants going, we have the nuclear plants going, they're just generating electricity and no one's using it. But they just kind of have to keep it going. When we get to a point where we can have large storage facilities where we can generate electricity and then store it for when we need it, that's going to be the real answer. So really long-winded question. I got a lot of other junk in there, but natural gas right now is cheaper than other sources, but we're seeing dramatic decreases in renewables. It's pretty exciting.
And Nick, I wanted to just ask another question and then also make a comment. Where is Canada on the Great Lakes Compact? You mentioned there was a
Right. Great question. So compact is a specific type of law that's in our federal constitution. And so compacts are agreements between states that then have the agreement of our federal government. So that's why it has to be passed by identical language by each state, and then the US Congress, Senate approve it, and the President signs it. Canada, the two provinces, Ontario and Quebec, that share the Great Lakes Basin, Ontario has an amazing amount of coverage within the Great Lakes Basin, and so they're very concerned about everything that happens here. We have what's called an agreement, which is not a treaty, but it's an agreement between the 8 Great Lakes states and the 2 Canadian provinces, where they agreed, they had a big signing ceremony and signed basically a contract saying that Ontario and Quebec would pass similar water conservation and efficiency laws to implement the compact as the US states. It's just that you can't do a treaty among states, that has to be done at the federal level, and we wanted to keep it specific to the region. So we have the compact amongst the 8 Great Lakes states, and then they call it the companion agreement with Quebec and Ontario. And Quebec and Ontario, to their credit, have gone along and passed implementing legislation to meet the compact standards.
And then the comment I wanted to make is, I just wanted to say generally to people here that if you're interested in pursuing organizing around these issues, Suzanne Stewart, I'm sorry, will be handing out some materials in the hallway after you leave, if you're interested. But I didn't want to make that as a closure, I just wanted to bring that up.
Yes.
You mentioned the hypothetical, the water monitoring, and then let's say that there's benzene, for example, that gets in the water. Then how does that get cleaned up? Who pays that cost, and does that come back to the company or the landowner that it's horizontally under them and they never agreed, has to get a new well? Or
My experience has been, and kind of going back and reading some of the history of some of our major contaminated sites where we've had human health impacts from toxic spills or from some leaks and that kind of thing. Usually when that happens, it's years after the fact, and the company that did it, maybe they were bought by another company, or they don't exist anymore, or even better, they're a subsidiary of a foreign company, and it's much harder to reach them legally to get a recovery. So that's where you end up getting into like diplomatic pressure, where like with the BP oil spill, the president had to kind of negotiate with BP, and they ended up putting aside a bunch of money. Then there's stuff working its way through the courts as well. But I guess what I'm saying is that it gets tricky. And so you have to be really careful about that. And one thing, even just at the leasing level, if you're approached by someone who's interested in leasing your property, if you have family members who have property, make sure they look at the terms of that lease and see if it's assignable. If another company could 2 or 3 years down the road take over that lease from that company, how long is the term? Can they have it for 10 or 15 years? Because the closer you can stay to the entity that's actually doing the work, and by you I mean property owner, but also the state or the federal government, the better we are, because we can get some kind of recovery to do that cleanup. But I don't want to blow this out of proportion, but I mean, we're still cleaning up contaminated sites from the Industrial Revolution. Well, yeah, I mean, there's all around the state, all around the country, there's toxic hotspots that are being cleaned up. So we have some federal dollars and some grants available to do that work through, you've probably heard of Superfund, which is like when they have these big major sites for contaminated sediments. The same kind of thing could probably apply with fracking, but what I'm most concerned about is just a local impact where you have a well that's drilled, there's some kind of a leak either from the drilling itself or from the storage facility, and you have people get sick. And that's, who pays for it? Usually you can get a recovery from the responsible company, as long as they still exist. But there's lawyers, their whole field of work is protecting companies when they go to buy another entity, to make sure they do their due diligence and try and figure out, okay, what liability are we going to potentially assume if we buy this whole company? Like Dow up in Midland, they bought a bunch of companies that had some problems back in the day, and they're still paying a lot of money to clean up some of those sites. So it gets really kind of complicated. Bottom line is, ounce of prevention is the way to go here, because if we can keep it out in the first place, it's a lot better than trying to clean it up. Yes?
Like 3 questions. The first question is, really briefly, is do you know what percent of the land in Michigan has already been leased to these oil and gas companies?
I don't know the number, but a lot of us here in Southeast Michigan anyway, our mineral rights were sold off long ago, but not everywhere. There's some communities, like I mentioned, Livonia, but also up in like Rochester Hills. There's Kensington, that area, they've had some major leases going on right now. So it kind of depends whether or not the developer way back when, 50 years ago or 100 years ago, sold off those rights, or if the area had already been mined. Up in the northern part of the state, they keep having these auctions multiple times a year for where they think there's a potential play for natural gas or oil, they'll go and they'll bid on those rights if they exist. A lot of this gets into speculators and people that will own these rights for a short amount of time and then try and flip it for a profit. And you know, I don't know if any of you guys kind of follow the business pages, but Chesapeake Energy, they just got nailed basically speculating oil and gas leases all across the country. Guy made billions of dollars, but now he's in a lot of trouble because it was all smoke and mirrors basically. So you get some of that speculation going on, but I mean, I don't know the percentage. It's you know, millions of acres I think are still probably available for some kind of leasing.
Now, the second question I had is, I was reading somewhere like if these guys come into your area and they get some percentage of the landowners to agree, then
Right.
they can say eminent domain, we don't care if you disagree, we got enough percentage from this quadrant that we can frack anyway. Is that
Right.
correct?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that there are certain thresholds that they have to meet as far as, like, if you've got a large subdivision, you'd have to get so many homeowners to agree before they could go ahead, but not necessarily everybody. And I would caution on that a lot of it would probably be kind of case specific, like what they're trying to do, where they're trying to drill. You know, they're going to put the well down the road and then come under people's property. Or, you know, are there common areas within a park or something that they would have to get rights to, either from the municipality or from the homeowners association?
The other question I had is, if they, get the rights and they don't do anything with the land for a period of time, then basically those rights are revoked. Is that correct? Unless they have a truck parked there, as if they're going to do something. Is that correct? I've heard something about that.
No, I mean, you can hold, I mean, there's leaseholds that can go on for terms of years for, decades. I mean, there's people that'll own mineral rights kind of in perpetuity or, forever. So I'm not an expert on the whole oil and gas leasing process, but these are just kind of some of the ones that I've looked at. These are some issues that I've identified. It's, you want to make sure what's the term of the lease? Can it be assigned to another company? What percentage of royalties, if any, are you going to get? Do they have insurance? Those kinds of things you want to look into.
Generally in the contract.
Yeah. I mean,
The contract stays with the land, not with the owner.
right. So that's a great point. You'll often have you'll move into a property and it might not even show up on your deed, right? Who owns this mineral? It usually doesn't. So it's just there, and that's where people run into the issue of the knock on the door. Hey, we're here to come come drill on your property. We need access. We'll pay you for an easement. That's kind of how it works sometimes with large landowners. Yes.
A lot of the drilling in the southern part of the state right now is for oil because they can get more money for it.
Right.
And my sense is most of that is in strata that doesn't need fracking.
Right.
But do you know if there's shale underneath that or it could eventually lead to fracking? Or?
Yeah, this actually kind of goes back to an earlier question where you have existing wells that have been somewhat depleted of oil or gas, and then they can come back and do fracturing. It all depends on the area, and they have some pretty sophisticated equipment where they can, it's basically like sonar, where they go around and they try and decide whether or not there's pockets of oil or gas under the land, and then at that point they could. So if you've got an existing wellhead, usually what they do is they cap them. They don't, I highly doubt it, especially in this day and age, that they're going to just abandon it and leave it alone, completely shut it down. Probably what they would do is consider coming back at a later time once the natural gas prices are higher, and consider completing that well with a fracturing operation. So yeah, you'll hear that a lot too, like, oh, we're just going to do a normal vertical well, traditional oil well. And that may be the case, but I would be concerned, if it were me, about what could happen 5-10 years from now if natural gas prices go up. You're going to come back in here and do fracturing. So it's definitely something to be concerned about. I've heard that they can go back and kind of complete some of these old wells that are existing, depending on property and who owns the rights and all that kind of stuff. Yes.
So back to the mineral rights that you
Right.
were referring to, so that's typically not in your deed when you buy a house? I
Right.
don't know.
Right.
So-
Yeah, I mean, you can look it up. Pack a lunch, go to. I mean, I'm not trying to be flip about it, but it's very hard oftentimes to figure out. Like I have a house in Royal Oak, and I went back and looked at one point, and there's nothing on there. I mean, I don't know. I'm assuming that they're not going to come in and drill there, But I would have to do some research to figure out who owns those mineral rights. A lot of them have already been sold off in the state, you know.
To the state.
Oh, well, or to the state, or to, you know, some entity from years ago. But yeah, a lot of it is owned. You know, in the northern part of the state, we had, and there's a lot of history that goes in here, but a lot of that land was, you know, most of the state was covered by pine trees, right? And so we lumbered it, cleared it, or there were fires, and then the state was like, man, this land's basically worthless. It's a desert up there. We have to figure out some way to do something with it, make it productive. So they started doing some aggressive reforestation. But at that point, the state took over, you know, millions and millions of acres of land, and, you know, holds title to it. And then over time, they've sold it off, including things like mineral rights. But then thankfully, we have some really nice state parks and nature areas from that time period too.
Right.
But you know, in Southeast Michigan, I think the situation's a little bit different. Number one, in a lot of densely populated areas, it's going to be hard to do the oil and gas development. I don't think the quality or the quantity is as great as it is in the northern part of the state either. Definitely for natural gas, but I've heard some interesting things about oil where they're interested in places not too far from here. So.
I'm sorry I'm talking too much, but did you know that, I'm sure you know, in Adrian, they're drilling for oil inside the city.
Right. They're talking about putting in an oil processing facility there too. Yeah. Yeah, I've heard about that. We're actually got a student looking into that lease actually. Ripped from the headlines. That's pretty good. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, so yeah, I mean, that's, you know, Adrian. It's you know, populated area. Money talks. I just quick little tidbit. When I was in ninth grade, I had my physical science class, and I remember I was we had to do like a research project, and I was talking to the teacher, and he's like, "What are you interested in?" I said, "I don't know. I kind of like you know, I like sports." He's like, "Well, that's not really going to work. You know, I like fishing. That's not going to work." It's like, "Well, I don't know. I kind of am interested in like government, that kind of stuff." And he's like, "Okay, oil." It's like, you're gonna research oil, and you're gonna look at, you know, the history of the Industrial Revolution. You're gonna look at, you know, world conflict and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, whoa, man. So ever since then, I've kind of always thought about oil, and because it's like the old black gold. You know, it really comes down to the money. And so where it is, usually they can find a way to get it. We thought we were getting close to the like peak oil in North America, as far as we got most of the oil out of America and Canada that we thought we could get relatively cheaply. But with fracturing and also with like the tar sands, that equation has kind of changed a little bit. So things like fuel efficiency in cars become all the more important, or electric vehicles, all that good stuff, if you care about the environment, because we keep finding oil and we keep coming up with new ways to process it, some ways that are hugely inefficient and very horrible for the environment. So even in populated areas, you end up doing that kind of development. Yep. Yeah, that's, I mean,
They don't care now.
right. I have a hard time, I usually don't come down too hard on oil companies, gas companies. It's because it's our lifestyle, right? We demand it and that's what we want. So, but the flip side to that though is I don't think we have been educated enough to know about all the real costs and all the real impacts. And I think once you add that stuff into the equation, we might start making some changes. So with that, I'm worn out. You guys had great questions. Thank you very much. This has been a wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.